correct me if I'm wrong. Welcome to the School of Media and Public Affairs here at George Washington University. I'd like to welcome all of you to our program tonight, which is Press and Media Relations in a Combative Political Age. What we'll be doing here tonight is we'll be having a conversation between people in both journalism and media relations about our effect on the public during campaign seasons. Now, outside of the actual candidates themselves, the American public hears from us more than pretty much anybody else in a campaign season. And sometimes it seems like reporters and media relations are on opposite sides. But does it have to be that way? Are we all striving for the same goal, which is to let the American people have as much information as possible to make their decisions during political campaigns? And so that's the conversation we'll have here tonight. I will start the conversation with some questions, but I would please remind our audience that we will allow you to ask questions as well later on in the program, because one of the things I've learned is that I don't always have the best questions, and sometimes some of you out there will have questions as well that you can ask to our distinguished panel. Speaking of our distinguished panel, let me introduce the people who are here on stage with me tonight. Roderica Applewhite grew up in Georgia, which, by the way, I don't like Georgia because they just beat Ole Miss the other night. Let's just be clear. She grew up in Georgia and is a political research and communications professional who has worked for several federal and statewide Democratic campaigns. She most recently was a director in the Public Affairs Division of SKDK. She was previously a senior comms advisor for the Michigan Democratic Party and is a Pete Buttigieg and Emily's List alum. She has a BA in political science from the George Washington University and is a class of 2021 political partner of the Truman National Security Project. Roderica, thank you for being with us here tonight. A New York native, Brian Walsh is a partner at Plus Communication and is an expert at helping businesses, associations, and other organizations across a variety of industries tell their story and meet their public policy goals. Brian worked on Capitol Hill for over 15 years, including as the chief communication strategist for U.S. Senator John Cornyn of Texas. BuzzFeed has called him one of Washington's top communication-obsessed operatives for the Twitter age, and most recently, Business Insiders named him as one of the top crisis communication fixers in the country. Brian graduated from Bucknell University. Brian, thank you for being here with us tonight.
Good to be with you.
Avril Silva is our SMPA representative on our panel here tonight and one of our rising stars here at the school. She's a sophomore SMPA student majoring in journalism and minoring in international affairs. That's right. And she's from Virginia. So thank all of you for being here tonight. So I'm going to start with you two, and I'm going to ask you to define what you see as the job of media relations for political candidates. Now, I'll just say here first that I was a political reporter for Associated Press here in Washington for just about 20 years. And I will tell you, I think from the reporter side, our job is to provide as much information to the constituents of candidates so they can make the decisions they need before they go to the polling booth. Now, my question to you, that's what I think the reporter job is. What do y'all think the job of media relations for candidates is when it comes to a campaign season? Roderica, we'll start with you.
Sure, yeah. So on the races that I've been on, it was really my job to advocate for the narrative that we were trying to push that day. Sometimes that would run directly up against the people we were running against. So in short, just trying to make sure they had a bad day. At least that's kind of what I did in Michigan, pushing back on the Republicans that were running against Governor Whitmer. But you have to do that without, crossing lines and boundaries, which I think, to the point of today's panel, is like, there's a lot of contention, and you have to needle that without kind of seeming contentious yourself. So it's just kind of a delicate balance every day.
Brian, what was your job when you were on the Hill?
Well, you and I worked together a little
yes.
bit, and you were always a very straightforward and fair reporter. And that, as a press secretary, that's all you really ask for, right? Is someone who's going to call balls and strikes fairly. I agree with everything that she said, and I think if you're, and that's what's a little bit funny about the name of the panel, because if you're being combative as a press secretary, now there may be times for that, you push back on a story, but if you're being combative with the press all the time, you're not being a very effective communicator, because you have to have a little bit of give and take with journalists who are covering your race. And I know we'll dig into that a little bit further, but you have to be a professional. You have to be the one who's calm, cool, and collected when sometimes there's chaos going on around you. And if you're not doing your job effectively. And so I think, again, what is your campaign's message of the day? What are you trying to get across to voters? Who is your audience? How are you being clear and concise and getting that message across? And if you're getting distracted by things that may swirl around you all the time, you're not getting your message out.
Did y'all see, and you see my southernisms coming in, did y'all see journalists as partners, as the enemy, as tools? How did you see journalists who were covering your particular candidates? What type of relationship did you have with the journalists that were covering your political candidates? Brian, we'll start with you on that one.
I generally always try to the extent possible, have a good relationship, because as a spokesperson, your credibility is the only thing that matters, right? If you lose that early on and they think you're not being a straight shooter, there may be times you can't tell them everything and you don't want to go there, but you have to have a certain level of credibility and respect for the journalists you're working with. And, to be honest, look, I think it happens on both parties, but I see it a little bit more on the Republican side these days with kind of the attacks on the media. I kind of see flack, I call them flack sometimes, press secretaries, we call it. But I see them, on social media sometimes going after reporters who are covering them. And I'm like, well, how are you going to have a good working relationship with this person if you're attacking them to thousands of people online? I'd like to counsel younger press secretaries to just say, look, this isn't personal. I mean, they're doing their job and you have your job. And it should never get into these sort of personal attacks that you're seeing increasingly, because you have to work with them at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And if you're kind of going after them publicly, you're not going to be able to do your job effectively for your boss.
I'll shorten it. Don't be an asshole. It's a lot easier to convince people with sugar than salt, or acid in some cases. On top of that, I'll add on Brian's comments, like, you never know who you will work with and who they will become in the next 5 years or next 5 years. I have really good relationships today with people who were press assistants or interns previously, and they remember that. And so it really benefits you to just be a nice person, recognize that we're all doing a job at the end of the day, and that you have to email these people your other pitch tomorrow. So make sure that they like you today.
Avril, do you believe any of this? Are they sugarcoating things for us here?
I honestly don't think so. I think, at least in my experience, looking at the difference between, obviously, the media relations side of covering a campaign and especially between, have those PR representatives, media relations representatives and journalists is super important to avoid, I think, those concerns that a bunch of you see more conservative, people kind of saying, combating that like fake news type of narrative that I think we saw a lot in both 2020 and 2016. So, yeah.
I like to view reporters sometimes as umpires, right? Look, there's going to be sometimes you disagree with what they're doing and how they approach something, and you can have a very spirited argument about that. It shouldn't get personal. But if you're doing that all the time, you lose your credibility. And so I think when you pick those moments to push back, you build your credibility with that reporter, and they say, well, let me take a second look at that story, because this isn't someone who normally flies off the handle all the time.
Right. I hate to sound like the old guy that I am, but Avril has grown up in the current system we have now, where we see reporters being called out and reporters being attacked. And I remember a day where reporters and political representatives, we all worked and we all went to the same bar afterward at night. So I want to ask about the relationship part. One of the things that I continually focus my students on is the relationship part of journalism. Getting to know the people that you're reporting on, getting to know the people who work with the people you're reporting on. from the journalist side, having a positive relationship with someone means that when you need something, they'll actually answer the phone. Let me ask about it from the other side. What do you tell press secretaries and what do you tell media representatives about relationships from that side? Do you encourage it? Do you say, don't get close to this guy because you might say something and it'll end up in the paper? How do y'all handle the relationship side?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously always a toxic reporter that's going to hate no matter what pitch you bring to them, but for the most part, it is still very much fashionable to reach out for drinks, coffee, or whatever. When I was in Michigan, what was really helpful for me, since I had so much lead time, I started really early in 2021, was just call reporters and ask them to just like talk about what Michigan politics has been over the cycles that they've worked and covered it. It was a really great way to get institutional knowledge from them that I didn't have since I was kind of parachuting into Michigan. And it also just kind of, you know, established, especially since I'm a younger woman working with a lot of old white men. Sorry.
Nothing to apologize for.
I think it helped, you know, ego stroke them a little bit. Just be like, hey, like, could you just tell me like what politics looks like here? And, you know, it got to the point where it built a relationship good enough that they were coming up with pitches to run by me to see if I could, you know, provide a quote for them or get a validator to fill out the story or pull some research for them or whatever. So just constant communication with them is really, really helpful. Calling them when you don't specifically have something to pitch is also really helpful. You know, no reporter wants to feel like they're an Oppo ATM machine.
Right.
And so, you know, just establishing that you're kind of approaching them in good faith just to, you know, just talk about news of the day with them is really been helpful.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, I've been, as an older person, I've been doing this, you know, 25 years, and I mean, just the other day, I got coffee with a reporter that is covering an issue I'm involved in, just to get to know them and say, you know, just kind of establish a little bit of a rapport. And I think, you know, sometimes I tell the younger people at my firm, pick up the phone. Right. You know, sometimes it's, you know, it's just emailing or text, and sometimes just pick up the phone, go to drinks, go to lunch, get coffee with someone. I think it works both ways. And to your point too, I think sometimes some of the better reporters I've worked with sometimes would call me up, maybe not when they know I'm really busy, when I was on the Hill, but they would just kind of call to check in and just, you know, what are you hearing? What are you doing? And it, you know, it was really smart on their part to just, even if we're talking totally off the record, you know, things they can't use, they're still picking up things. And so they're, you know, working their sources a little bit.
How would you tell a young journalist to approach someone? Is the cold call, hey, I just want to know, just go out and just get to know you? What's the best way to make sure the relationship from the beginning is a positive one? That one of the things that I tell my students all the time is that the one thing you don't want is to have the first time you meet someone's representative when something bad has happened. So you want to talk to them and get to know them when they are in a comfortable position, not when their hair's on fire and the world's burning down around them, and then that's when they first meet you. But how should a journalist approach someone in the PR realm? What's the best way for that relationship to start?
Yeah, I mean, reporters have DM'd me, texted me, I've emailed them cold, and you just kind of start from there. The nature of the job is I'm supposed to answer numbers that I don't recognize, and they're also supposed to answer numbers they don't recognize. So it's pretty easy if you just like make that initial outreach.
Really? Just call.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think this goes both ways. Just also be accessible. And so it's funny, I've been on both sides now, right? I've been on the Hill, where reporters were the ones calling me all the time, right? And working on campaigns, and they're the ones calling you. And now, in the last 10 years, I've been more on the PR side, where we're pitching client stories that maybe aren't the most newsworthy things all the time. And you know, I used to have reporters complain when they're like, oh, so-and-so's press secretary will never call me back. And I'm like, oh, he's not doing his job. But sometimes I'm like emailing pitching reporters and they're not getting back to me. And I'm like, I get y'all are busy, but if you're not interested, like a simple hey,
no
I
thank
got
you.
this, no thank you would be nice. And
Right.
And I just, you know, I just have noticed increasingly, you know, people, I think it all goes back to, you never know who you're going to work with one day.
Right.
And, you know, it's funny, I work on a variety of issues now that are far maybe removed from campaign or Capitol Hill politics. So aviation, right? I've never worked with the aviation reporter for, I don't know, this newspaper. But I've worked with 3 other reporters who cover other things, and those reporters can help, quote unquote, vouch for me a little bit that this person isn't, you can trust what he's saying at least. And so I always tell people you just never know who you're going to work with.
And I'm one of those jaded old time reporters who seem like everybody's hair is on fire, especially during a campaign season. What are you seeing as far as when you're reading and watching these press conferences and these stories? What are you seeing? You're thinking when it comes to the relationship between the press representative and the reporter. Do you see it as a normal thing that everyone seems to be screaming at each other?
I think it's interesting because when at least you look at some, like, for example, like a White House press conference or just any kind of media conference, press conference, you kind of start to see those escalations of, journalists trying to get their questions in and, those press representatives being a little bit more evasive of certain questions. And I think it's interesting to see it start to become part of the norm of that conversation or that relationship. But I think something that you both have kind of touched on is the positive aspects that I think journalists want to try and get out of it. And at least as young journalists, something that I've seen between like my peers especially is there is some of that apprehensiveness to pick up the phone and, actually call somebody because you never know how that relationship is going to go. So to see that, that actually is an effective way to build those relationships is actually kind of a relief to hear. But I think, looking at, specific press conferences and how, you see it kind of start to escalate like that. It's, I think something that everyone should be wary of, at least on both sides. But I don't think it's something that is necessarily too dangerous, at least trying to get the narrative across, at least on both sides. And I've seen press conferences that, are perfectly, civil. So it's, as a young journalist, it's interesting to look at that and be like, oh, it's very exciting because of how, angry and emotionally fueled it can become. But I think there is still room for that animosity. It's, there while still trying to, build good relationships, I guess.
Well, one of the things I want to be clear on is that we shouldn't judge the relationship between public relations and media by what we see here in Washington. Because once you get outside the Beltway, I think the tension ratchets down a lot. Here in Washington, we take everything to the absolute extreme. But once you get outside of Washington, I think the relationship's a little bit different. But I do want to ask this question because I went through this as a journalist as well. How do you handle it when you have a very obvious bad actor? Whether the person is a journalist who is clearly trying to push that journalist agenda for whatever news organization, or on my part, when I have a press secretary who blatantly lies about something. I will tell you on my part, when that happened to me, I immediately went back to my editor and the other reporters and said, hey, just so y'all know, we can't trust what this person says, so we shouldn't use him in any story because that person is clearly not telling us the truth. But on y'all's side, when you have a bad actor who is a reporter or a columnist or someone or a blogger or someone who has their own website, how do you handle a bad actor from your side?
Yeah, I can go. So in Michigan, when I had some reporters that were of that persuasion, I would always make sure that I did everything in writing. So make sure that we agreed on to the attribution on writing, whether it's on background, off the record. If I was giving a quote or asked to give a quote, I would submit the quote in writing. Even if they called me and said, my deadline is 50 seconds ago, I need a quote right now, cool, I'll email it to you. Right. And just make sure that I'm recording conversations with them also. But just make sure that you have all the receipts you need in the event you need to go to an editor, in the event your boss is like upset that something got misconstrued. Just, it's helpful to just have a paper trail for stuff like that.
I think that's exactly right. I would hesitate to go to an editor right off the bat. You know, you're trying to work with this person. He's basically going to their boss. But sometimes it rises to that level that you have to appeal to higher ups to say, look, can we just, here are the receipts. Can we walk through this? And, you know, in this story, there was 4 quotes from the other side and one of mine. It was already buried in the bottom. Or your reporter came to me 50 seconds before their deadline and said, give me a quote, which also told me the story was already written. And you didn't make any effort to really get my side of it, and you're kind of jamming me at the last second. It just tells me you're not, you know, a good actor. You know, sometimes you could also, there's little games you could play, which, you know, you could also take it a step further. Let's say these are reporters who are counting on you, or they're you know, they you go to, you know, you start feeding things to their competitors and playing. You know, only say, you know, and they have to explain to their editor why they didn't have that story. I don't like to do that because, you know, again, you want to build relationships with people, but if someone is consistently being a bad actor and not being fair, if I have news, you know, I give that to your competitor newspaper, and then you come to me and say, well, and I say, well, look, this goes both ways.
Right.
You know, I don't
Once
like
again,
to
back
do
to that relationship.
but there's little, you know, but there are things you can do, and like if you're not going to treat me fairly, well, you know, we can kind of both play this game. I'd prefer not to, but.
Have you ever had to demand a correction from a reporter?
Well, many times.
Did you get it?
Yeah, I mean, generally, sometimes. I mean, it depends. I mean, you really have to have a compelling case. Look, editors, and I don't blame them, are naturally going to stand up for their reporters. They work for them. But if you have a compelling case and you can say, look, this is something they just blatantly got wrong. No, it happens. It happens more than it should. But look,
yes,
reporters are human.
Are human
mistakes
as well.
Get made,
right?
And you know, people are writing quickly. So I mean, you try to be understanding about that. The challenge sometimes is, you know, we live in this hyper. You know, it's like an hour by hour, 15 or maybe 15-minute news cycle, and sometimes like on campaigns, you know, the opposition say would drop a hit piece on your candidate. The story gets written. And then they blast out the story to everyone else, and maybe the correction doesn't hit for another 30 minutes.
Oh,
and so, so like, it sides both ways. But
have you ever had to demand a correction?
Absolutely, and this is why I always say tip your researchers, because especially
you have researchers.
Yeah, well, I used to be one. So one story comes to mind when I was on the Pete campaign. It was a pull aside at one of his rallies, so like there's really loud music playing. The transcript on the reporter's end was kind of muddled. Completely incorrect statement about Barack Obama was put in the LA Times at 5 a.m. It took us a bit to fix the story because we had to dig through our transcripts and find it, and we were meticulously transcribing everything, and there was a lot of press pieces moving that day. And so we found it, we like had the clip, we played it for the reporter issued a retraction, but it was just like, at that point, it was too late anyway. But yeah, you have to make sure that you're always recording that stuff.
In this hyper political age, and on top of that, with the addition to social media, is a correction even any good anymore?
I think so, especially when it's something like that, in which you know, you've got a Democratic candidate for president saying something that obviously sounded very disparaging about the first black president. Sometimes you have to do it. Other times it's like, oh, well, they were this, you know, this oppo was, they had a homestead exemption versus, you know, a domicile one. It's like, at that point, it doesn't really matter. But for stuff like that, it's always worth it. And I think it's helpful for the reporter too to know that you mean business and will chase anything that makes your story not look the way you want it to.
it's also important, I would just add.
Yes, please.
You know, things can quickly turn into TV ads these days. And so, you know, when you're shipping an ad to a TV station, you basically have to substantiate every charge you're making there. And so, you know, when you have that correction, you're able to obviously, you know, make them pull, you know, sometimes the opposition has to pull down an ad or it doesn't get up in the air in the first place because you can show the station that what is in that ad is incorrect.
I want you to jump in here.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's interesting the way that I'm hearing about, you know, these issuing of corrections, because on the journalist side, I've had not specifically like media, relation organizations or anything like that, but in a lot of my different stories that I've done, I've had people come back to me afterward and be with their employers being like, I want a correction for what I was said or what I was quoted for in this story. And it's interesting because going back to that like relationship building part, I think the way that I think both parties kind of react to that is super crucial in maintaining that relationship, because I've had and granted, they were not, I don't think the person I was interviewing was media trained whatsoever, which is a completely different issue. But I think the way that I think both parties react in that way makes a huge difference in maintaining that relationship. Because if, let's say, the person coming at me with a correction is at least very defensive or is showing a little bit of an aggressive stance rather than wanting to give the reporter a chance to have it be a learning opportunity, I think it starts to strain that relationship a little bit for future opportunities. And at least for me, like whenever I look at different corrections being sent my way or something like that, I obviously look at it with my editor and want to make sure that there is some validity with it. You see what we should do, but also like getting across the fact that I want them to also respect the reporting done on that side. So it's interesting to see. I think, in my opinion, those corrections are still necessary, even though in social media you can look up like, oh yeah, that was like a false statement or something. But I think they are kind of necessary, at least on the reporter side, to treat them as learning opportunities and at least try to maintain that level of professionalism and an amicable relationship with PR representatives.
Yeah, I would just say, oh, sorry.
No, please.
I would just say, like, I'll be the first to admit, that's something I had to learn early on in my career. I date myself here, but about 18 years ago, I was working as a press secretary on the Hill, and my boss at the time, who I really liked personally, because I had worked for another member of Congress before him, who was a really not a nice person, and my current boss was a really nice person. We considered him friends, but he got enmeshed in a very high-profile lobbying scandal that kind of dominated the news in Washington. But I remember for the first 6 months, I was like hyper defensive about my boss, like he's being attacked, and I would vigorously correct stories, with reporters, or look to correct stories and kind of pick fight. I let it get a little too personal, and it shouldn't have been. And it was a good learning experience for me that, you don't need to like hysterically start yelling at a reporter or an editor to get a correction. I think when you're calm, cool, and collected, and you show them the receipts and you really make a genuine effort, you get further than yelling.
One of the things that we've sort of referenced several times here, but I want to ask it directly. How has social media changed the relationship between journalists and media relations? Because in the past, once again dating myself, you would do your interview, you do your story, it'd go back to the office, it would be edited, and that was an hours or days long process. Now it's, if you get an hour between the interview and the actual publication of the story, you're doing really well. Because now everyone wants their material on the web, on social immediately. How has that changed the relationship? I know from the reporter side, it means that you're, instead of actually talking to people face to face, you're sending emails and you're working off the phone, because I don't have time to get up and go to your office and ask you this question. So I'm just sending you an email, I'm sending a text, I'm making a phone call, instead of the face-to-face relationship that we used to be able to have in the past when I had time to make these relationships. On the other side, how has social media changed your relationship with the media?
I think it's made pitches really interesting. Like, I've been able to land things by saying, look, a lot of people are tweeting about it. When I called them 2 days ago and they wouldn't run it as an actual story. And so you can kind of reverse engineer pitches that way, which has been really interesting. I think it democratizes who you speak to also.
What do you mean by that?
I think, there's a lot of younger journalists and journalists from more diverse communities that have used social media to just kind of directly get their stories to the communities they want to. It's made it easier to kind of circumvent traditional press and media. So I think it's been really good for that, and I think it's been able to, give voice to a lot of people who would have had their stories ignored otherwise. So it's been really interesting for those reasons.
I've definitely used a lot of people are tweeting about this as a pitch. And I would just offer, a slightly another take on this though too. As a journalist, I would be just always careful, and I see a lot of newsrooms grappling with how they handle their reporters' social media policies, right? And look, reporters are people too. You have opinions, you view things, but I think sometimes you have to be careful about how you're airing them on social media because sometimes I'm an avid Twitter user or X. I still always going to call it Twitter. But look, I mean, I'll see certain reporters and be like, I went a little far with that one, and kind of made let your personal opinion get in there a little bit. And look, I mean, I will have if I have a client doing an interview or back in the day a candidate, we'd look at that. I'd have someone go through the researcher, look through that reporter's social media feed and pull out, are there kind of any hints of bias? How did they cover this issue in the past? How did they cover that? And so I would just say as journalists, just recognize that we're watching you as much as you're watching us. And so I think it's something you just need to be mindful of.
I think it also makes it good for when you're cold pitching reporters on something to go through their tweets and see what their beat is or what they're interested in. So to be able to warm up the cold pitch a little bit by saying, hey, I noticed you talk about this, would love to pitch this to you.
But that almost sounds like doing opposition research on journalists.
Well, but it's also think sometimes to the point that was just made, finding an angle to pitch. Look, we have say sometimes obscure corporate issues, and we'll say, okay, well, who's been writing about this? And there's a way also to personalize your pitch. Right. I mean, as reporters, you're getting, or bookers, producers, you're getting a million pitches a day. I mean, you're to your point, I can't get time to get coffee because my inbox is getting. But to the way I always kind of tell our younger people at our firm, personalize it, find a way to say, hey, I saw you wrote on this a few weeks ago, or here's another angle you might want to think about. And it's a way to kind of build a relationship that way.
I think looking at the way that you were talking about social media, and I kind of wanted to touch on what you were saying, Brian, about how the different lines that journalists can kind of get close to when trying to have their own social media, while also trying to keep that objectivity in journalism, I think is a huge struggle, at least for young upcoming journalists, because you see at least so many people trying to have some sort of voice for advocacy for their own views, and seeing that as, even if in a performative sense, having just that your opinion out there not only sets up your credibility, at least in a much younger demographic, but also makes you a little bit more in tune with your audience. So I think it's interesting to see how those kinds of biases can sort of start to come up in reporting. And something at least that's been emphasized in, at least here at GW and different classes I've taken, is the different ways that still acknowledging those different parts of you as a reporter, but also making sure that you're trying to make a fair and objective piece. And those can still happen. And I think going back to how that relates to the relationship with media relations, and how that kind of ties in with the fast and rapid journalism that is kind of being required of newspapers nowadays. It's interesting to see how, I think it's important for young consumers to make the difference between something like, a media relations representative, and the way that they're framing something, and looking at how a journalist might frame that story, and try to make it at least as fair and equal as possible.
Going back to this, because I'm curious about this. How much research do y'all put into reporters that are covering your particular industry, your particular candidate? Do you do the same type of background research? Because I know as journalists, whenever somebody gets hired, the first thing we do is we go to what used to be called the morgue, but now we just say we go to Google and see where this person has ever popped up before and what that person has ever said and whether it's something that is newsworthy. But on the media relations side, how much research do y'all put into the people who are covering y'all's principles?
I guess it depends on what the pitch is and the narrative that you're trying to push. So in Michigan, I really worked with the same crop of like 35 reporters that all covered either political, campaign comms or anything going on in Lansing. So usually it was just like, who are the people that I need to know in that kind of cohort? Otherwise, if it was something that was like moving, that was pretty niche, I just need to know who's talking about it right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, unlike the folks we're running against, we're not checking to see if you paid your taxes. we're not going that deep.
Right.
But, I would look at, what's kind of your available biographical information, see, oh, you went to college, this person went to college here, just things you can do to maybe build a little bit of a rapport with that person. But again, also just looking back at what they've written in the past, I think is helpful. But I haven't had a situation where we've done a really deep dive on this person and tried to find oppo on a reporter.
Well, one of the reasons why I asked this is because it's one of the things that I do tell my journalism students, that whenever you walk into someone's office, you do immediately quick scan of the walls to see if there's some way you have a connection with the person. So if someone has a picture of a yacht on their wall, you talk about the time, one of the first things you say is, oh, I love boats. And I used to fish with my father. You tell the truth, obviously. As journalists, we always tell the truth. But you try to find a way to connect with that person by doing a quick scan of what's available to you. Once again, trying to build that relationship. My assumption is that the same thing is being done on the other side. You're trying to find some way to build that relationship with that reporter, because at the end of the day, we all do have our jobs to do, but it's easier when you have a positive relationship with someone. Am I incorrect about this?
No, I think that's spot on. I think the better communicators do that.
Right.
Like I said, I see this trend sometimes, particularly on the Republican side. I don't think it's a good thing where, they some of them view reporters as the enemy, or they're only going to talk to, Fox News, or only going to talk. And I think, I'll just say it, Governor DeSantis' campaign, for example, when he was governor, I think maybe they felt they only needed to speak to conservative outlets. And, they started the presidential campaign kind of in a media bubble. And, you sometimes forget ABC World News Tonight gets 8 million viewers. Sean Hannity is a good audience, but it's probably around 2.5, 2.75. ABC World News Tonight gets twice as many people. If you're not talking to ABC, you're missing out on a huge swath of voters. And so, there's certain states or certain races, maybe you can get away with only talking to left-leaning media or right-leaning media, but when you're trying to run a national campaign, you can't, ice out some of the biggest news outlets in the country.
Yeah.
You have to have a relationship.
Yeah, I'll back that up on Pete. We had a go everywhere policy. We got a lot of flack from rival campaigns for putting Pete on Fox, but at the end of the day, that's where 67% of Americans get their news, and they're not all crazy. And so, you just have to make sure that you're reaching people where they are. And, if you're letting, perfect be the enemy of reaching people and getting your message across, it's not really serving your message.
Pete's campaign was a case study in how to do really effective media relations. Here was a guy who is a mayor in South Bend, and their comms team just put him in front of everyone. And look, sometimes, they had a benefit of a really smart candidate who wasn't putting his foot in the mouth, and you can't always do that. But I think it was a good case study in just going out and really finding platforms to get your message out, and it really vaulted him, to a position that any other probably smaller town mayor would not have found themselves in.
Well, I have a couple of more questions, but I want to remind our in-studio audience that we're going to open up the questions to you as well. There'll be a microphone available to you once we get to the question, but I want you to start getting your questions ready. One of the things that I am curious about from the journalism side is if you had advice to a young journalist on how to forge a positive relationship with a candidate and his or her staff running for office, what would be your suggestion for that young journalist? What should we be doing?
Yeah, I would say, pick up the phone and be nice, and also
Be nice.
Pick up the phone and be nice. And also, I've got a relationship with a reporter who's pretty young, and she, typically every Monday or Tuesday, she's like, I'm on the Hill. Is there anything that I should know this week? I've got 15 minutes if you want to just connect on anything. Just making yourself accessible, because now it's to the point where I'm expecting that text on Monday, and I'm like, I need to have something for her. And so it just kind of primes you, and that's something that you can do both ways. That's definitely, the type of relationship that I had with journalists in Michigan. They knew that they would hear from me every week or so, and if I'd gotten really busy and they hadn't heard from me, they'd do a little welfare check on me to make sure that I didn't have anything that I was giving to other people instead of them. And so, just kind of creating that kind of economy of scarcity a little bit with reporters that you're talking to is really helpful.
I agree with all that, and I would say here's one thing not to do, which I sometimes see increasingly among younger reporters, and it just, as maybe I'm older, it just drives me crazy. Frequently I'm going off the record, on the record, on background, in conversations with reporters, and sometimes, again, because people are busy, I'll send a pitch or try and send something first over email, and I'll just be like, hey, so off the record, you may want to check this out. And there's a handful of times the reporter writes me back and says, and I understand there's maybe disagreement in this, but they'll say, just so you know, I have to tell you it's off the record before it can be off the record. So I'm like, so let me get this straight. I have to email you and say, can I email you something off the record? And then you have to affirmatively respond back, and they'll say yes. And so just among younger reporters, I'm like, all right, well, you're not someone I want to work with. You're gonna make life difficult. I mean, there has to be a little bit of give and take. Because there is some arguments sometimes among younger journalists about what's off the record. And look, I generally think everything is on the record unless you specify it all as off the record. But there's got to be a little transactional relationship where I'm trying to reach out to you, just flagging this off the record. I shouldn't have to have 4 emails to establish the ground rules.
Right. I will say, back in the past, I would not have off the record emails. Because literally, if you write it down, it's on a record.
Yeah.
So, but those conversations, but establishing the rules of the conversation before you have it is critical.
Absolutely.
Because I don't want anyone to be unclear about what I'm going to do with what you just told me.
And look, I mean, I've good friends who are reporters, but we don't let sometimes that interfere with things. But I always tell some younger folks I talk to, I was working at the NRSC, and one of these Tea Party candidates had knocked off our favorite candidate. And it basically meant we effectively lost the race, because this person was not going to win a general election. Right. And a reporter from one of the TV stations, cables, that I had a really good relationship with, and almost, we had gotten drinks many times, called me up, and he started off, he's like, wow, you guys are screwed. Very whatever. And he goes, so are you guys going to still spend money on this race? I'm like, no, she's down 20 points in the general election. And it was 11 o'clock at night. I thought we're just bantering.
Thought you were just talking.
10 minutes later, I turn on the TV. He's like, I just got off the phone with the NRC. Now, the way the Republican Party worked that time, this candidate ended up raising $3 million attacking us because the establishment wasn't backing her.
Of course.
So I didn't get a thank you note for that. But, but it was a lesson to me that I always tell people, look, you can have good relationships with people, but you always establish the ground rules first.
Right.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Make sure you know the culture of the beat reporter that you're working with. I think political reporters are very different than crime reporters, which are very different than education reporters. I definitely stepped in at once thinking I had we're on the phone, nothing's actually been discussed pitch-wise officially, so this is off the record, right? No. And then it was Michigan Democratic Party says, oh, shit. And that was with me talking to a crime reporter, which I was not familiar with his game. You just have to make sure you kind of understand. Crime reporters are very, gruff, different. On the record, all the time.
As a former crime reporter.
It was just different than the kind of just fluid exchange of information that I was used to with political reporters that I've worked with.
Amber, what questions would you ask?
I'm actually so curious about the different rules that have to be set, because especially for young reporters, we sent out God knows how many emails, like for a specific story. Even sometimes before we like pick up the phone and, actually have like a Zoom call or, something like that. But I'm just curious about, and you were mentioning like, the off the record over email, because as a reporter, you look at something like that's written, you're like, oh yeah, that's like, I can use that. But I'm just curious about, how the evolution of these, like, I guess, rules or, especially when, something like Zoom, for example, is having interviews so like accessible, how you think that is, changing, especially for, young reporters coming in and, trying to break in on the scene, whatever, beat that may be, whatever you may be collaborating with. But I'm just curious how you think that's been evolving.
I mean, I think the rules of attribution have always written themselves, and you just kind of have to figure it out based on who you're dealing with. No one ever sat me down and was like, here's what on background means, here's on the record, here's off the record, here's without attribution.
You didn't take my journalism class here.
Sorry.
We talk about that.
Well,
but I'm sorry.
Would have been helpful 2 years ago.
Yes.
So I mean, Brian's gonna kill me, but like, I am definitely like, can I give you something off the record? I need you to say yes, and then I will give you the thing.
It's good to be safe.
Yeah, just like completely make sure you have all your bases covered. And so, yeah, I mean, but I think it goes back to relationship too. Like, if I have a rapport with a reporter, I know when they call me to say that they're interested in writing something or that I'm trying to pitch them, it's automatically on background at a minimum. But you just have to know the reporter ahead of time. And so, I've definitely seen flacks get themselves in trouble for going off on a report and then saying, oh, wait, sorry, that was supposed to be off the record.
Off the record,
And it's too late at that point. And so you just have to make sure that you're always like, and if it feels a little stiff at first, just be like, can we go on background? I mean, I think it still helps that 2 seconds can save you a lot.
And I'll also say for source development, like, I would also just say on the front end, hey, can we just go get coffee just off the record and kind of just talk, get to know each other? And because I don't want to go to lunch with someone that I think we're like on the record.
Coffee,
or
yes, but
yeah, no, but like, it's if you want to, this is a get to know each other.
Right.
Hey, I just started this beat, or I saw you just started as the campaign spokesperson. Can we just go grab lunch just off the record? And I want to hear your perspective, learn about you. And again, I like to think anytime alcohol is involved, sometimes that. If you're getting drinks with folks, that's generally considered off the record. But again,
confirm.
Well, to your point, I was in an age, and I'd like to think it still happens. I don't know as much, but even my Democratic counterparts, I mean, we could fight it out all day, but we could all go down to get a beer at the end of the day and
tune in.
Spend many nights
Take
there.
your bars carefully, though, because if you are having an off-the-record drinks with someone at a reporter bar, and another reporter hears it, that is a tree falling in the woods. So, make sure you don't do that.
And that has happened to me. I mean, again, I think there's a lot of trust that's required on both sides, and this hasn't happened often, but there's been 1 or 2 times over the years, maybe more. But I told something to a reporter off the record that I knew they could have only gotten from me.
Right.
And they came back, they're like, we confirm, I was like,
we confirmed it through someone else.
Yeah, I mean, so again, if I kind of feel burned by a reporter like that, I'm probably not, going to trust you as much.
Right.
Because sometimes, even if I can't tell you things on the record, source development is really important because I can just give you, look, I can't talk to you about this right now, but just for your planning purposes or just for your awareness, let me just talk to you kind of off the record about what's going on. And I think as a reporter, that's helpful. Just
That's
context,
always helpful.
even if you can't use it at that moment.
So we talked about it from the young journalist side, but for people coming up through political communications, what would you tell them that they need to know now about their future relationship with journalists?
You just never know. Like I said earlier, you never know who you're going to see again. And also, like, with that, you never know, like, reporters move around just as much as flacks do. There's sometimes a staff assistant with the Daily Caller or with Breitbart or whatever, and it's like, I'll send you my quote. I'm already sending it to everybody else anyway. Like, that's fine, because then eventually in a few years they'll be at AP or they'll be somewhere else that then your higher ups want to pay attention to.
Right.
But then they'll remember when they were a baby journalist and you wouldn't answer any of their emails because of what their masthead was. So. It's just important to, you just never know who you're going to see again. Everything gets smaller and smaller as we both climb our own ladders. And so you just want to make sure that you were known as someone that, remembered them when.
Good advice for future press secretaries, what would you say?
Yeah, just establish a relationship as a straight shooter. I mean, there may be times, especially in campaigns, you're not, by virtue of the situation, you can't share everything you know. I mean, you're trying to manage the situation, but don't lie.
Right.
And I think it goes both ways with reporters. I used to, and I never forget this. This was almost 20 years ago, but there was a big investigative reporter for one of the top newspapers, and his MO. Sometimes I put reporters in categories. There's like the straight shooters that just call balls and strikes fairly, and then but there's also some folks who think they can get away by bullying you a little bit. And this guy's MO was to lie about his deadline. And he'd say, I need this right now, my deadline. I'm like, who's a 2 o'clock deadline? But
Well, nowadays you might, but back then, no.
And I just have never forgotten it. But that was his MO. Like, I need this within an hour. You have an hour to get it to me, and like just bullying. And I've just never forgotten that. Like, I'm not going to work with you again because I don't think you're an honest broker.
Right.
But I think that goes both ways. I mean, I'm working with reporters today that I worked with for a variety of things that I may have worked with 20 years ago.
We worked 20
years ago.
20 years ago.
But it's like, you never know where you're going to be.
Right.
I say that too about even the politics side. I mean, when I was at the NRSC, which was one of the more partisan jobs in town, I never let my relationship with my Democratic counterpart get personal, right? And I work with them today, like on some things, and we can be in the same conference table on the same side of an issue, depending on what the issue is. And so, like, just never let it get personal. It's a job.
Right.
You can be a forceful advocate for your boss, but don't let it get personal.
Yeah, you're going to run to that person that tune in or at Hawkins.
It's a small town. It is a small
You're going to run
town.
into that person sooner or later. So I want to make sure that I leave time for some questions from our studio audience. So if you have a question, we have a microphone back there in the back. Please just introduce yourself for us. Or you can listen to me ask more questions. So are there any questions out here?
Hello. Hi. I'm Tejasvi Ramu. I'm a grad student here at SMPA. And I had a question in terms of like dealing with international journalists, especially in an incredibly globalized era of news. And I mean, American politics is consumed by not only Americans today, but people across the globe, especially when it comes to the election season, the major election seasons. My question to you is, have you had to engage with foreign press? And if so, like, how do you ensure your messages translate well, into like for the foreign audience, as well as how do you also, I feel like sometimes you'll also have to play the part where you're maintaining sort of the American identity and sort of that element of it. It's not just maintaining the identity of your candidate, but also the country itself and portraying it.
Yeah, I think the most experience I had with this was on the P campaign. So often we would have, like local TV crews from countries want to come to a rally, which we always thought was really cool. So, when it made sense logistically, we would invite them and they'd have a great time, and then we'd get really cool clips the next day. I think, for something as accessible as like them showing up to a rally or something, there wasn't really a lot of those considerations that we had to think of. It was really just making sure that they were credentialed. But that was the experience that I had.
Yeah, I think, they have a tough job because if you're on my side of things, you're not, your audience is the voters in your state. And that's not to say that some of them may not be living abroad, but you're not always as much of a priority. But I would always try and not everyone does, but I would try to put myself in the shoes that they're doing their job. How can I help them? Get them a quote. Don't blow people off.
Right.
But I do think it's tough sometimes. So they'll, if I only have so much time for my candidate and there's a home state newspaper or TV station versus foreign, I'm generally going to go with where I get the most eyeballs.
Right. And same thing on the thing that we have to think about now on the journalism side is that in the past, you had to do special things to make your stories go global. Now everything is global. So we have to make sure that we explain things in our stories that we didn't used to have to because we knew we had just an American audience. Nowadays, we have to explain everything. And it's made us have to think more about what foreign audiences, how foreign audiences are interpreting what we're writing. Since we no longer write because of the social media, we no longer just write for American audiences. We're writing for everybody. We're writing for anybody who can find our story. And on the internet, you can find just about anything.
I think it's also interesting, before we move on to the next question,
sure, please.
That, you're not only, especially for foreign and international reporting, you're not only looking at, targeting those, audiences abroad, but also looking at, maybe people that are new to the country and looking at, news organizations. Like I am the daughter of immigrants, that basically had CNN en Español on like every single day. And I think it's interesting to at least for media relations representatives to look at, their relationships with those journalists as well and try to be in tune with those sensitivities as well to some of the cultural differences, not only in the sense of reporting, but also in the context that they also know is, very interesting. So I think not only is the foreign reporting going to, foreign audiences, I think it's also going to people that are also going to be voters here. So I think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind as well.
You're absolutely right. I think it's something I try and drill down, particularly on the Republican side, to make sure we're talking to as many audiences as possible. My wife is from Bolivia, and my mother-in-law lives here in Maryland, but she just listens to Hispanic news. And if you're not, if you're a campaign and you're not talking to them, especially with such a massive Hispanic population in the country, you're not touching a lot of people. And when I worked for Senator Cornyn in Texas, it's a state with 22 media markets, but also huge different demographic populations, Indian Americans, Asian Americans. And so we would try to also kind of hit some of those newspapers that spoke to those audiences as well.
I think we have another question out here.
Hi, my name is Hazel Smith. I'm a freshman in SMPA, and I was just wondering whether you could expand more. You started talking about the Go Everywhere policy, and I work for a candidate right now, and I think one thing that we struggle with is how to balance that of getting him everywhere, but also not sending him into a hostile environment, kind of a Shark Tank kind of atmosphere. So how do you balance that and know when and where to send your candidate?
Yeah, so on Pete, when we were pitching reporters or outlets that were a little bit more off the beaten path, we would do kind of pre-calls with them to see just where they thought the story would want to go, what questions might get asked or what topics might be touched on. So just making sure you're doing that ahead of time is helpful. But usually, it goes back to kind of researching what they either post about or what their interviews look like. It's just helpful to know, usually reporters like that where it's like a full ambush situation, it's not their first rodeo doing that. So it's typically easy to get those smoke detectors on ahead of time.
And I would just add to that, as a journalist, I'm not expecting you to tell me every question, and nor should you tell me every question you're going to ask. But I'd like to get a general sense of what you'd like to talk to my candidate about. And if we sit down for an interview and you start off in a totally different direction that is nothing along the lines of what you said you were asking about, that's probably the last interview you're going to get. Yeah. So you kind of have to think, do I want to be short-sighted or do I want to have a relationship with these people?
I think also looking at, having those really strong relationships with, with whatever environment you may be going to, especially if you're going to be sending your candidate into a place where, you're also not familiar with and wanting to, grow that audience and engagement with a place that, has yet to be touched by your candidate. I think it's super important to not only know the journalists that are going to be there, but also the demographic that you're expecting to, collaborate and engage with. Because if you don't know, the people that you're catering to in that, specific place, whether or not it's dangerous, you're not going to get much out of it. So I think not only on the journalist side, but also looking at the consumers and voters side of things, making sure that the types of people, not only journalists that are going to be asking questions, but also just regular people that are going to be asking questions about toward your candidate, and knowing the types of demographics and people that you're going to be engaging with is super huge. So doing that research in advance, I think, is also incredibly important.
And I will just give a minor defense of the ambush. There have been times that literally happened to me where something happened right before the interview that I had no intention of asking about, but I'm looking at the wire, and all of a sudden
Oh, yeah, news of the
something
day is
happens
fair game.
somewhere
Of
else.
course, totally.
But I will say I've always tried to at least say, hey, here's a copy of what just happened.
Yeah.
And I have to ask about this. I have you sitting in front of me. My boss will kill me if I don't ask you about this right now.
No, I
Yeah,
mean, it's
that's
entirely
fine.
fair.
But still, it's the communication and the relationship. It's not me starting the camera and then asking you about something you've never heard of before. But once again, it's about establishing that relationship so everyone knows where they stand. But unfortunately, we're out of time. So let's give a good round of applause for our wonderful panel here. And we'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight for another one of our wonderful programs here at SMPA. Thank you all for coming, and good night.